Peace, y'all. It is I, the Emma, Energy Master Allah, and you are watching the Leopard in the Mirror, Canticle of the Mutant Guardian lecture series. If you don't have your book, make sure that you go ahead and grab that on Amazon. This is episode 16, still in the book 2, The Power of Wisdom, and this is Canto 15, Cipher, the Refresh of the World. As you know, I record these live on Facebook and then I upload them to YouTube. So if you are watching on YouTube, make sure that you go ahead, hit that subscribe button, hit that like, drop a comment. We're going to keep it pushing. So we'll come over here. I'm going to read through the canto and then we'll go through it. All right, let's do it. Canto 15, Cipher, the Refresh of the World. 1. Ring Wake. The circle inhales, the page refreshes, not to erase, but to reveal the history of edits. Breath returns bearing the ledger of what changed. 2. Word Skin. Word is membrane, serpent string. Dogon syllables stretched across the void. See, I power her power I see. Outflow returning as source, Taurus of breath and law. 3. The Gate of Dawn. Once a serpent at the road, now an eagle in the crown. Initiate becoming air, earth's coil finding wings. So the tribe of Dawn learned altitude. What crawled through trial now sees from mercy. Daniel, Don L, stood within his vision as in an OBE, consulting his chi as saints assembled. Not fallen, but descended to restore dominion to the just. 4. Ledger of Names. O keeps the audit, Beta Israel not erased. The rumor of omission overturned by flight. When history lied, the ring preserved the trace. For a cipher records returns. Our markings are our seal. No stamp required on foreheads. We were born signed. 5. Midrash/chain. Midrash spirals. Blockchain appends. Append, don't amend. Reveal, don't conceal. Renaissance failed where empire revised. Our renaissance rises where the record remains. Justice is version control for truth. 6. The ether mirror. Unheard songs strike the dielectric ether. Forms appear as their reflections. Alchemy mirrors the 4 market days. Commerce of elements under ether's gaze. Fire pays air, air credits water, water endows earth, and earth, interest compounded, blossoms into time. 7. The IY switch. Cipher is the field, cipher the method. I is the inward eye that decodes. Y is the branching Y that tests. Switch wrongly, and 7 becomes 11 by slight. 34 is not 74. Understanding. Culture is not subtract God by what you see. Do the knowledge before the wisdom, or fall from the ledge into the pit that calls itself proof. 8. Serpent and bull, winged and wreathed. Apis in the cube, Apophis in the coil, Taurus, oscillation giving world its sway. The winged serpent, Hermes, Thoth, Quetzalcoatl, is Don's emblem fulfilled. Earth wisdom feathered by sky sense. Messengers who do not topple idols, but teach stone to remember its own song. 9. Noahic balance, Abrahamic edge. Mother conscious peoples kept contracts with forces. No conquest, just reciprocity with rivers and stars. Father conscious covenants added rails for fire, so it would warm, not consume. Mixing chafed, then reconcile. child of both. We learn to govern heat with love and let devotion kneel to understanding. 10. The forge of language. As tongues evolve, so does the world. Letters precess Yod to I to J. Names refract Yahweh, Igwe, Amadioha, and yet the current stays. The Dio in the thunder, the breath in the name. Fourier proves the fragment holds the hymn. Holograph of the whole inside, a shard of sound. 11. The public physics of bond. Word is bond because the world is bound. To speak is to tension the string. Break your bond and spokes shear from the wheel. Keep it and the city rolls true over time. Integrity is not morality, it's engineering. 12. The eagle's descent. The higher the flight, the kinder the landing. Don's serpent did not vanish, it learned to glide. Wisdom kept, vantage gained. Saints return not to conquer Rome, but to refresh the page and leave the changelog visible. Distribution 1 to 5 to 6. Knowledge coheres as power. Power circulates as equality. The ring pays out in common light. No private sons, just shared daylight. What returns ascends, what ascends returns. Oh, complete the breath and begins it again. 14. Hold on, what am I supposed to be on 14? Yeah, 13. So 14. Closing ring. The circle exhales, the page refreshes, not to erase, but to reveal the history of edits. Breath returns bearing the ledger of what changed and what endured. All right, so this one is a trip. This is the recursive logic of the cipher. All right, let's go through it. Okay, Rainway says the circle inhales, the page refreshes. Not to erase, but to reveal the history of edits. Breath returns bearing the ledger of what changed. So your breath is an oscillation. So you breathe in, you breathe out, wash, rinse, and repeat. It's a cycle. So the word for spirit, peace, Cheryl. Thanks for joining. The word for spirit or spirit itself comes from the etymology meaning breath. And in the Bible, the word pneuma is used for it. We've talked about that before. That's how you get the word pneumonia. It has to do with lungs. But more importantly, it has to do with breath. So breath and spirit. And more importantly, breath is not air. Breath is the circulation of said air. So that is the significance in the conversation about cipher, aka a circle. Consistent of 360 degrees, of course. And so you've got this concept of learning to shift from a understanding of life as something that is linear to something that is a cycle, and then working our way to understanding how it isn't a loop that's happening over again. It's more like a spiral that rises upward each time it comes around. So 0 degrees and 360 degrees are not the same thing, even though they appear to be the same point when looking at it from top down. But if you turn that thing sideways and then take a good look at it, you see that we're rising each time we go around. Word skin. It says word is membrane, serpent string, Dogon syllable stretched across the void. See I power her, her power I see. Outflow returning as source, Taurus of breath and law. So word is membrane. So in ancient Egypt, as well as in the Dogon mystery schools, the Dogon of Mali, if you're not familiar with them, in Burkina Faso, west coast of Africa, they both had a shared mystery school teachings. And so the Dogon's isolation for the long amount of time that they've been over there, they've been separate from the Egyptians for something like 6,000 to 7,000 years. And so for them to have the same teachers means that they and the Egyptians come from a common mystery school sort of dynamic, and so a lot of people associate that with ancient Kemet. All right, and so in those teachings, the serpent represented word or membrane. So even in the hieroglyph for the word Jed, which means to speak or say or to a recitation or incantation or it's anything along those lines, the glyph is itself it includes a cobra or an asp, if you will. Okay, so if you start understanding how the ancient world associated serpents with speech, vibration, membrane. So the membrane is a bridge between two environments, if you will. So the membrane around the cell membrane, that is what separates one environment from the other. So that interface is the connection between heaven and earth in terms of symbolism. And so once you start understanding that, you see why Jesus is referred to as the Word of God. So word, membrane, serpent. He even compares himself to the bronze serpent of Moses, the Nekustan, or whatever. He had to erect a post and then put the bronze serpent up there, and then it was the way that the people who were afflicted by the snakes in the wilderness were healed by looking upon it. So that was a metaphor for this right here. All right, so we already talked about the Dogon and the obsession that the UFO UAP community has with them because of their stories, but they only tell you the version that they know you're gonna run with. They keep the underlying meaning of the mystery teachings to themselves. The void, we got this concept of the void associated with Akash and the Cipher, the number 0. The discovery of the number 0 was brought about due to the grid system that was used in the ancient world and mapping sound to the body. Using a matrix grid. Whenever you're talking about a matrix, you're talking about a 2D grid system, and when you're talking about membranes, skin, you're talking about a 2D surface. So these same principles go hand in hand, showing you why the ancient teachings associated word, membrane, serpent, all that together. See, I power her. Her power, I see, that is a mnemonic semi-acronym for Cipher. See, I power her. Those are supreme alphabet distinctions. So C or C, I or Islam. P is for power. He or her is the letter H. And in the definition for Cipher, it uses this, it's kind of like an acronym and a backronym. Her power, I see. So C is to have, be equipped with both insight and eyesight. I is self and self is God. I is one who has resurrected through the knowledge of self and realizes I, self, Lord, am master. And Islam is mathematics, and mathematics is I, self, Lord, and master. So this understanding that what makes you you is quantum, it is supreme, it is not all these things that you've stacked upon that in terms of ego and even your experiences. You are not your experiences. You are not the things you've done. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who observes and uses those things as a tool. You operate the body, not the other way around. Those things belong to you, but they are not you. Any more than this laptop belongs to me, I am not the laptop. You accumulate those things around the truth of who you really are, who is a permanent frequency address in this universe. Outflow returning as source, torus of breath and law. So the geometric topology. So You can look at topology as the skin, the membrane of a shape. And this becomes important in a conversation about 3D volume because we only ever really interact with the 2D surface of a 3D object. And so the 2D boundary of an object is considered to project the information contained in the bulk. So at the center of your bulk of a body is the DNA that is embedded in all your cells, and it is distributed holographically, which means that every one of your cells is we're not gonna say a copy, but it emerged from that original zygote, that original cell that, came together from your mom and your dad's contribution. And that's a nice way of saying they had sex. Sorry to put that image in your head, but that is how you came about and became that cell. But every other cell that came after that has a copy of that information that was in that first cell, and then it was specialized and given a local rule that ultimately results geometrically in your global morphology, which is your overall shape, your outward appearance. And so the topology, that surface geometry, is intimately tied with that concept there. And so the torus, the donut shape, is a very important topology because it introduces the idea of being topologically equal to zero. Cipher is a zero, a circle. So what that means is that the inner part of that torus, that, the tube, that's the same geometry that a tree uses. It's called hyperbolic geometry. That curvature that goes inward is considered negative curvature from a topological standpoint. So that's why it manifests in our perception as a hole in the middle of said donut. Now, the outside of that same shape, when you're looking at the outward ring, the outward equator, that is positive curvature. And so because the cross section of that donut is essentially a circle, that means that however much that negative curvature goes in, that's exactly how much the outward curvature goes out. So they cancel each other out. They balance each other out from a topological standpoint. All right. So no net value. All right. And so because of this, any point on the surface of that torus experiences itself as if it is the center of the torus, because every point is technically connected to every other point. And the only way that that's possible in a 3D environment, in the way that we live here in our perception, is that every single point contains the information of the whole. So every point contains the information of the whole. That is a holographic principle. If you have a hologram, like you get the holographic stickers, or you get like whatever you have that's a result of holographic photography or printing, if you cut that image in half, if you cut that film in half, you're not going to get one half over here or one half over there. You're going to get two complete images. Like whatever the complete image was, you're going to get two of those. If you cut it smaller, every time you cut it, you're going to get a whole image. It's never going to be partial because it contains all the phase information of the light, not simply a copy of how it looked to you from that particular angle. It gives it a recorded complete phase information of the light itself. So when you shine light onto that holographic printing, it is actually reconstructing all the directions of light from that the object that was being photographed, and you end up seeing a 3D object. Okay, and so once you understand those concepts, you understand how toroidal geometry is a dimensional step above us. If you take the shape of the earth, the globe of the earth, and you scale that up to 4 dimensions. We typically only deal with 4 dimensions in the form of time or timing. then that becomes a toroid. And the easiest way I can describe that is look at the orbit of the moon. The orbit circles the earth. And so if you had an image that showed every single position of the moon moving around the earth, it would connect right back around to itself in the form of a ring. So that would be a torus or whatever. So this is how we look at time. So if you saw time as a single object, it would be something like that. But here in 3D, we have to see that 4D geometry one slice at a time, and hence we perceive that as animation and growth. The gate of dawn. And you hear I'm saying dawn, not Dan, because this is Hebrew. And so it says, once a serpent at the robe, now an eagle in the crown. Initiate becoming air, earth's coil finding wings. So the tribe of Dan learned altitude. What crawled through trial now sees from mercy. Daniel, Dan plus El stood within his vision as in an OBE, consulting his chi as saints assembled, not fallen, but descended to restore dominion to the just. So this part right here is all about Daniel chapter 7. All right, so Daniel chapter 7 is one of my favorite chapters of the Bible, because throughout the book of Daniel, he is mostly translating visions and dreams for, who he's working for. In that particular case, he was working for Nebuchadnezzar II. And Daniel 7 happens to be Daniel interpreting his own vision. He's prophet. He's a prophet. He has a prophetic dream, and he's describing his own vision for a change. And in this chapter, it gives a breakdown of these 4 beasts, and that's an important concept in terms of esoteric imagery, this concept of the 4 beasts. But then each of them represents I'm gonna be honest with you, these are people who were perceived at one point in time as a Messiah. So the Messiah, Messiah, this was a concept that long preceded Jesus as Messiah, and the Jewish conception of which is not that it was different, it's just that it had more nuance that is typically lost upon the average Gentile studier of Christianity nowadays. But that word, that Messiah, that gives us Messiah, it actually originates from a root that means wiping. So this is how we get the concept of anointing. But even that root itself is actually a combination of 2 roots, where the wiping or erasing is actually along the side. It equates purification with the returning to one's primordial state. So this idea of wiping the slate clean, you kind of heard that concept a little earlier talking about the Cipher, but this idea of returning to one's primordial state. The other root that's included in that is to become fluid. And essentially what it's really describing is the process by which really water, but then I don't want you to get stuck on just physical water, because it's conceptual water. So the animation, the taste, which is tangibility, and fluid form, the ability to transform and still maintain identity, all of that stuff is coming in there. So it's basically uses water as a metaphor in order to understand how the same one thing transforms. And then that's the dynamic between God and Jesus. What was lost in the nuance by the time, Christianity reached us in modern times, is that it followed the exact same model as the Trimurti Trinity of found in Hindu culture. But it was understood and clarified there that the figures of Brahma, Vishnu, and Rudra, but you know him as Shiva. Those three are essentially just a single being, but just different stages of the process. And so they were always talking about going through a cipher, just like we've talked about 360 degrees of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, creating a perfect circle or whatever. It's the same exact concept. But then we got a little wonky with our Trinity. No, a lot of people don't even really understand what the Holy Spirit is, but somehow it's supposed to be co-equal with God and Jesus in that dynamic. But remember what I just told you, spirit is breath. And so to have a Holy Spirit, so holy means complete or consecrated. So that means it's aligned at the proper angle that is right. When we say righteous, it's not a moral thing. It is proper alignment. Earlier, I said that your true self is quantum. It's numeric. It's informational. Information isn't something we made up. It's what informs the unfolding of matter and space and all of that good stuff right there. It's unmanifested. It is in the form of potential. And it is an infinite well of potential. And so that infinite well of potential is what informs the organization of matter by applying its information in the form of geometry and topological constraints. And then what emerges from that, which you could look at as the arithmos, the mother, the matrix that puts those constraints. What emerges from that is the son archetype, which we call the logos. And so the relationship between mother and child, so Mary and Jesus, is captured in the relationship of arithmos and logos to form what you know as logarithm in math. And so a logarithm is essentially what helps the binary code of the quantum to instead organize itself sequentially. So what that means for you is that you experience time in a linear fashion one moment after the other, and that allows us to have separate frames of the animation without things feeling broken up. Time occurs to you as if it's moving forward and it's smooth because of the constraints that are imposed by the physical matrix of this universe. All right, and then there was something else I was going to say about sequence, but it's neither here nor there. And so this is what allows us to experience a cipher. The space in between each of those numbers is what gives us clear-cut distinction between one moment to the other. Otherwise, it would just blur into one complete reality. All right, so now we got this matter of the serpent at the road. So this is a comparison that's made in the Bible for the tribe of Dan. All right, now the tribe of Dan, their original symbol was the serpent, but it was later changed to the eagle. Why is that? Well, in the esoteric world, in the mystery schools, a serpent represents a new initiate. So it was serpent or fish. These are similar and often interchangeable symbols. So a new initiate was the serpent because they had the knowledge, but not yet the wisdom. They had the information, but they did not yet have the application. And so when you talk about the Nakash in the Garden of Eden, the serpent at the tree of knowledge, that word Nakash is used instead of the word that is used for serpent when you're referring to the tribe of Dan, because they were talking about literal snake there. But in the Garden of Eden, that word Nakash, that root, it basically means either the shining one, or it means a diviner. So divination specialist. So this is the interesting bridge that allows you to realize that these concepts that are in Genesis are much older than Judaism, because they already existed in the proto-Niger Congo groups that broke up into, your Yoruba and Igbo and the Bantu and all of these different groups. They already had this stuff in their teachings before, before they broke up and before people even moved out. Well, you had humans that had left the continent and things that had moved, but then you had these different waves of migration that happened due to climate change. When the Green Sahara started to dry up, you had one group that moved south and one group that moved north and out of Africa, and then that's how you ended up with the people there that you are probably more familiar with in terms of biblical narrative, but they were part of a shared group. Now, the significance there is that the various forms of divination, including Alpha, Ifa, and the Dogon analog to that Efa, all of these are rooted in the same type of system that Panini used in, I think it was a 4th or 5th century BCE, in order to map a matrix onto the tongue and map phonology of the mouth in order to shape the Sanskrit language. So Sanskrit and its contribution to Proto-Indo-European language is what shaped just about every language that you could think of today, including the English that I'm speaking right now. All right, so those come from similar systems of mapping the membrane of the body. Okay, so don't let people think, don't let them make you think that we are all something separate, or that our beliefs come from different places. Each person took the same central concept and they ran with it. And so the only way to really establish peace on this planet is to do a little time traveling and then see what the seed was before, everybody went and you grew their own separate trees based on it. All right, but the serpent is the initiate without the knowledge. So you've learned the system, but you have not yet applied it and understood it. The eagle represents the spiritually adept. And in fact, it's a little more nuanced than that, because when you bring those two together, you get the concept of the winged serpent, which is essentially a dragon. And what a dragon actually represents, the etymology of the word itself means I see clearly. And so remember that concept of the purification, which means to return to the primordial state. The yogic practices were largely rooted in returning to Shunya, which is the void, the original state. So wiping the slate clean, wiping the slate clean. It's like the innocence of a baby, but achieving that state after having had the experience and knowledge. So there's a difference between you being a fool. So in fact, this is exactly why the fool card is 0 in tarot, because he is both the first and the last card. But you don't know if the fool is so carefree because he knows nothing, or is it because he knows so much that he's not worried, right? Like to a lot of people on the surface, by the skin and the membrane, you think that it's two, you think it's the same thing. But if you understand the pathways, the actual path and the journey that he went on, then you know. And so that becomes very important in a conversation of who we are and what we are. It doesn't really matter if you came to the same geometrical conclusion for your outward appearance if you did not also follow the same sequence of steps to get there. It's like, it's not really like that, but I just feel like bringing it up. So it's like that show, Is It Cake? Now, both the boot on the left and the boot shaped cake on the right, if they were done by a really, really, really good artist or whatever, they look alike. But a very different process created that cake than what created that shoe. Now, if you're in the market for a new shoe, you'll be very happy with the process. by which that shoe came to be. But if you got a taste for cake, you want that process. And so this is one of the things that we're going to have to confront in the near future. They have kept us in a very surface type of conversation when it comes to our apparent differences based on appearance and whatever else. And the way that they have discussed these things, they make it seem like they're just arbitrary features that don't matter anymore. But that only stops mattering when you have a world that is dominated by bureaucracy, and which is trying to move the world into a cold, mechanical type of control. Because if you can make humans one size fits all, they become expendable. The second that you are specialized and you are unique and you're individual and you contribute something to the world that nobody else can, you become too valuable. And that becomes a threat to institutions or individuals who themselves do not have an intrinsic value in and of itself, because of the way that they live their lives. And so they instead rely on adhering to the system they've created and getting you to subscribe to said system to make it such that they're the greatest within that system. I don't care how good a chess player you are, that doesn't automatically translate into skills on a basketball court. You aren't the master of games, you're just the master of that particular game. I'm not going to say that Serena Williams is a horrible athlete because I beat her in soccer. She specializes in tennis. So this is what we're dealing with here. All right. So anyways, the point of bringing up the dragon is that a serpent as an initiate, when that initiate reaches a certain level of mastery, see, the old Chinese lore was such that a serpent that lives long enough becomes wise enough to sprout wings, legs. They can fly. They can do all of this stuff right here. But from an initiate standpoint, what this is actually describing is reaching a level of shamanic mastery in which you have properly cultivated the hippocampus to allow you to have out-of-body experiences. Whether or not you're actually leaving the physical body, that is up for debate from what I've experienced, but only because I know that you don't need to actually leave your body in order to navigate the information of this universe. Because, like I said before, it's a holographic principle such that your hippocampus already has a map of the entire creation. How does that happen? Because everything was a uniform plasma at first. All you had was one material, and it had what's called a baryonic acoustic oscillation that flowed through it. So there was an imprinting of the first sound of the universe on every bit of matter. So everything has that same information. And then it began, after that point, once that plasma started to cool, it started to organize itself relative to that, that one oscillation, that one sound. And so everything differentiated itself in a way that appears global and connected, but in reality, every single one thing is only concerned with the things immediately next to it. So you have what we call local rules, but if everybody has the same local rule, it says based on my position, based on, where I'm at in the matrix or whatever, this is how I behave. This is what I do. And the guy next to me, I'm affected by him, and then I affect the one on the other side of me. So this is the basic organization principle of everything in the universe. You are just a condensed version of that with your cells, but it's the same cellular logic throughout the entire universe. Crown initiate, becoming heir. Air is intellect. Air is communication. Earth's coil. Earth is when you become solid enough to have essence, where microscopic remnants of you are able to interact with somebody else even without you physically making contact with them. So you bring those two concepts together and you get an idea of what language actually is. So the tribe of Dan learned altitude, so they learned to fly. What crawled through trial now sees from mercy. Daniel, so Dan means judge. This is why the tribe of Dan were known as being judges. That word is taken out of context slightly because it has identical meaning as Elohim. So the Elohim who create in the beginning of the story, then that name means the same thing as Dan. So in the case of Daniel, El, of course, being the God, the oneness of God. So we have the judgment of that one God, or to have God's singular judgment. This is why Daniel was a prophet. If thine eye be single, you know that from Matthew. This is what Daniel was doing. By that eye being single, what you mean is entrainment of the brain hemispheres. If you undergo processes that allow you to entrain the hemispheres of the brain, the half of the hippocampus that controls the mapping of space connects with the other half of the hippocampus, which maps language, and whatever your linguistic understanding, it is superimposed on the spatial mapping of the hippocampus. And so in an OBE, you are able to interact with the objective information of a space, but you also have an overlay of additional information that doesn't normally translate into physical space, and it is being translated in the form that makes the most sense to communicate to you based on your linguistic structure. So the more aligned your linguistic structure is with actual physics and mathematics, the easier it is for certain unfamiliar information and forces and things of that nature to occur in a more true to life form. Otherwise, there is a tendency, particularly in people who are not of D or E male haplogroup lineages, to have a slight bit of semantic drift that ultimately results in slight hallucination. Not to say that the thing is not there, but the shape and way that it presents itself is probably not the most accurate form, but it's the best form available to try to translate for you as the individual. And so this is why the initiation, those trainings that they gave, were especially important. And so before you become the type of seer for hire that Daniel, you have to go through a good deal of training and conditioning for them. And so his vision, after he goes through, talking about the different beasts and what they were doing and so on and so forth, you have this part where it talks about him trembling. You got this part where all of a sudden there's somebody else in the room that is explaining to him his vision. Well, how does this person understand what his vision was? He wasn't inside Daniel's head. Well, it's because it is describing an out-of-body experience. That trembling they describe, anybody who has actually been formally trained in those methods knows that when you get ready to exit the body, it's like a loud, almost like vacuum, like you're in a vacuum tube, type of noise, like you pop, like you literally sound and feel like you're popping out of one place into another. And this is essentially lowering the gate of the thalamus, which normally filters certain frequencies out. And that's what essentially carves out and shapes your perceptual reality. But when some of those filters are dropped and you're getting pure raw information from everywhere or whatever, that experience is such that it is slightly intense the first time that you do it. But you are completely aware, completely conscious. It is nothing like having a dream at all. It is, at first, it's even almost disturbing how not just similar to waking reality, but it's like regular reality on steroids, where it's like you've got hypervision, hyperhearing. It's like seeing you operate better than ever before. Consulting his chief, so there was really his guide, his double, his spiritual double, standing in the room with Daniel, explaining what he's seeing, what each of these beasts really represents. That saints assemble, not fallen, but descended. We got this problem with talking about falling beings when the words used in some of those cases is actually descended, as in your descendant. So in some cases, it's just saying you are related to something, not that that thing fell physically. Restoring dominion, you know, the narrative of the saints returning, you are those saints. 4, ledger of names. O keeps the audit. The letter O keeps the audit. Beta Israel not erased. The rumor of omission overturned by flight. When history lied, the ring preserved the trace, for a cipher records returns. Our markings are our seal. No stamp required on foreheads. We were born signs. So the tribe of Dan is believed to have become the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. They are more accepted in Israel now that they've kind of subsided somewhat on their exclusion of the darker tribes. But, you know, there's still, of course, issues. They, you know, once they gain access to Israel, they kept in poor conditions, and it's just a bad situation overall how they do them folks. But Beta Israel, tribe of Dan, that's what Samson was part of, the tribe of Dan. So this concept of the Nazarite vow comes into play. That's what I'm currently under. That is why I do not cut my hair or my beard until my vow is fulfilled, and it is intertwined with the construction of the Gifford Historical Museum and Culture Center that we are making here in order to help kind of combat some of the lunacy that's happening here in Florida right now, where they are making laws to where you cannot even speak about certain subjects. And it's ironic because a lot of the same people who've been out here, First Amendment, are the main ones telling you, well, First Amendment as long as you don't talk about that. Yeah, all right, so you say we're not a fan of your opinion, but you aren't a fan of our facts. So that's the weird dynamic we have to deal with here. Tribe of Dan, they so in Revelation, you've had people try to spin it where they're not mentioned in terms of receiving a seal on their forehead. And some people try to make that out to be because they said, oh, well, the tribe of Dan, they were doing idol worship when they were in the north, and that's why they were skipped over at the end. No, that's just propaganda to try to once again, try to shit on black Jews. What actually happened is And this is something called, you can look this up. It's called YAP plus insertion. So only the D and E haplogroups have this feature. It is a set of dormant genes that were activated tens of thousands of years ago that ultimately rapidly advance hippocampus function in the Homo sapiens who remain on the African continent. This particular insertion event creates a geometric structural impact on the RNA and DNA involved in this process, such that certain packing principles of the proteins and whatnot cause the brain to basically cause that section of the brain to basically operate the same way that microchips, like a computer, operates. And so the rendering process, if you will, of how we came to be able to perceive reality became very computer-like, if you will. Now, in contrast, the other male haplogroups outside of those, they largely adapted, well, in terms of those who left Africa, so that's mostly the C groups, they managed to evolve their hippocampal function through mixing with Neanderthal. Once again, you have what seems like the same solution, but drastically different paths. The consequence of hybridization with Neanderthals was the elongation of the skull. So you had a change in the morphological structure of the skull and brain. When you change the shape of something, you change its function. The way my laptop operates is because that chip is organized in a 2D flat orientation. So it's very good for strict binary type gating, like the knowledge of good and evil, flat logic. Whereas a globular skull, the rounded skull that was adapted by those who lived in the Horn of Africa before moving south, it basically constrained the brain to golden ratio proportions. And so the golden ratio, if you know anything about it and its inverse, which we will get into a lot more in the commentary section of this book, the only difference between the golden ratio, the only difference between that and its inverse is that phi has a 1 before the decimal and its inverse has a 0 before the decimal. But everything after the decimal is identical. That's 6180339 so on, is identical for both. The only thing that's flipping is that 1 or 0 in the beginning. So whereas you had the binary type of relationship when it came to the flat chip, if you're talking about phi and its inverse, essentially what you have is the flipping of that 1-0 while also having something that stays consistent and tethered. So as opposed to two things having to be separate and experiencing two things entirely different from one state to another, that tail that occurs there is what allows something to be retained and something to be rebooted. That is your quote unquote blockchain that we keep returning to in this narrative. Okay, and so anyways, the tribe of Dan, they were not omitted because of idolatry. The case in point, they had what I'm talking about. They didn't need the mark on their forehead because they already had naturally what the others had to receive in the end. So basically, the veil being lifted, if you will. So I am still researching and looking into exactly what that means. I mean, we can tell by the symptoms of the world, you know, who might be a little delusional, but if we don't also understand what the reason of that really is by the inner workings, then we have a tendency to devolve into things like racism and bigotry and mythical thinking, as opposed to actually understanding the underlying science and not being so attached and reactive compulsively to it that we can actually have meaningful solutions and dialogue in the wake of said thing. The disclosure isn't going to be nearly as involved with aliens that aren't from here as it is how certain developments and choices caused some divergence in the signal, if you will, the signal that makes us who and what we are. You had some divergence, and it has had consequences, but that was a necessary consequence. So in return for that thing enhancing the ability of the people outside of Africa to imagine and hallucinate wildly, so everything that they talk about seeing in them stories, they probably did see it that way. But by groups mixing and blending together after being separated for a very, 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 very long time, however those means might have been, some nicer than other circumstances, but whatever the case, it has basically created a generation of individuals, particularly African Americans over here in the quote unquote new world, who have just enough of the Neanderthal shift to kind of expand the capacity to visualize, dream, and things of that nature, but not so much that it overrides that natural computer-like adaptation. So the unique advantage that creates is that you can activate that capacity to visualize and then tap in and access the hippocampal information, but restrain it in accurate physics so that you are able to essentially have a virtual experience of the universe as a whole, to be able to navigate that in out-of-body experiences. So that is the thing that humanity has been evolving toward. All right, so Dan didn't need, because remember, Revelation is a vision. This is John of Patmos who is describing the vision he has. So Revelation is the only, so it's an apocalyptic text, and it is the only prophetic text in the entire New Testament. So as far as Christianity is concerned, the only prophecy, the only real prophetic work in the New Testament is Revelation. So if you want something that has continuity, like there's other ways you'd have to decode some of the continuity with some of the other parts. But in order to really get a sense of continuity with the Jewish tradition of the Old Testament, Revelation is your go-to. So if you read Daniel and read Revelation, you'll be able to start piecing together some of the symbols and understand somewhat what the original understanding of any of this stuff was. So all the stuff that's contained anywhere else is also contained in some way, shape, or form in the first 5 books, which make up the Torah. So the first 5 books of the Bible are the Torah. It's just been translated into whatever language it is that you speak, but that's essentially what it is. Moving on. Midrash chain. So Midrash spirals, blockchain of pens, append on a men, revealed on conceal. Renaissance failed where empire revives. Our Renaissance rises where the record remains. Justice is version control for the truth. So they booby trapped the Bible. These ancient works were built on these mathematics and geometric principles. So everything was built off of the initial matrix. Based on some of the research that I have seen and have experimented around with, technically you can generate the entire Bible from the geometry of the first letter. I know that sounds wild, but in this Hebrew, if you're using the Ashuri letters, which are the square letters, which were developed, where at least, how to put this, they were restored, if you will, using the Imperial Aramaic grid system. Keep in mind, Jesus spoke Galilean Aramaic, so he spoke Aramaic, so it is this mathematical language. And because the writing is based on that geometry and the grids, it is based on certain relationships. And so the geometry of now the first letter of the text is Bereshit. So the first letter would be Bet. But that's not the first letter in the Bible. The first letter actually appears as a number, which is the Aleph. So each of those letters also has a number value. And because the Aleph had to be used to number that verse, it's technically the first letter. It's just that it's functioning as a number in that specific case. All right. And so that shape is very similar to a letter N. And the significance there is that that crossbar of the N, if you place this within a square, it is highlighting the diagonal of that square, which is equal to the square root of 2. Whenever you stack squares diagonally, you're essentially building a matrix. And so if I have a diagonal 2 squares long, that's going to go from square root of 2 to square root of 8. If I add another square, that's square root of 18. If I add another square, it's going to be square root of 32. If I add another square, it's going to be square root of 50. If I add another one after that, it's going to be square root of 72. You probably ask yourself, how do I know that by heart? It's because it is the exact same. The radicand of each of those square roots, that 2, 8, 18, so on and so forth, that is the exact same progression of the shells of electrons. Let me say it again. So this matrix that is expanding out, and the length of this line expanding out, follows the same pattern of organization of electron shells. The first shell holds 2, the second shell can hold 8, the third shell can hold 18, and so on and so forth. Whenever you see mathematical principles aligning like that, you need to ask yourself what's really going on. So the same matrix that shapes speech and then creates the constraints of your phonology and your pronunciation is providing the same spatial organization structure that electrons follow, because they operate in a field of probability. Remember, probability is potential. I told you potential is quantum. So the same thing that allows you to speak, the same process that allows you to speak, is the same process that constrains matter for you to perceive electrons. There's technically nothing there in terms of physicality, but it's informational, and that information is projected onto our perception of matter and mass, such that it is real in our experience of it. It's going to have the same electromagnetic and field boundaries and everything else. So it is there as far as you're concerned. while you're in the physical, those things are there as far as you're concerned. But what I'm telling you is it's the information that's real, and then everything else is just assembling itself around that information in order to essentially create an abstract representation of that information. All right, you don't see it as ones and zeros. You see it as a ball or a bed or a wall or a laptop. You don't see the ones and the zeros. And those ones and zeros are in the form of on off. So open space, something, 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 open space. So those patterns actually communicate information in and of themselves to the matrix of this universe in order to project what is and what is not. So midrash is a word that, so the reason I bring up this idea of generating the entire Bible from the first letter is that midrash is essentially, you take the Torah, so the first 5 books, and then you basically write new stories using the same template. It's basically the idea. So the same story is told over and over. It is all a story of how we move, how we transform geometrically from spirit to physical, cyclically. How God becomes the child archetype through moving through the matrix. We all go through that. We all do that. There is not one of us who's not that, but we experience ourselves as something separate so that we can learn or we can create and whatever else. But when we move out of this, we're essentially just all the same one thing. But like I said before, it is not a cycle that circles back on itself, but it is a spiral. So we're constantly building upward or whatever so that things don't collapse back into themselves. But they can know the original self because it is always at the center and at the source of you. And so it builds like a blockchain. This is what I keep on returning to. The Renaissance failed where the empire revived. The empire, the Romans, everybody had their own political take on what they wanted you to believe. But if you were truly initiated into the system, it reveals to you through mathematics what the truth is. You can tell when somebody's changed something when the lines do not add up. And that was common throughout the ancient world. The eighth mirror, unheard songs strike the dielectric ether. Forms appear as their reflections. Alchemy mirrors the 4 market days. Commerce of elements under ether's gaze. Fire pays air, air credits water, water endows earth, and earth enters compounded blossoms into time. So a lot's being said there. Ether is the 5th element. So you've got the 4 elements, which are fire, water, air, and earth, and those arise from the ether. Ether is essentially the information. It's the physical manifestation of that information as non-interactive material, something like hydrogen plasma, whereas because it doesn't have an electron, remember that electron from before, the probability field make you see image. Because it doesn't have that, it does not interact with the matter around it. It just passes through it. And so you have a fluid of that, which is essentially unitary in form. So it has a similar type of function as unit cells in a matrix. All right. And so whenever a field is applied, an external field is being applied to something, like if you apply it to a vacuum from outside of said vacuum, it causes particles to start forming inside of it. But essentially why that happens is because the non-local state of that thing is being pulled toward a center. So you're basically activating the vacuum, literally like a vacuum that pulls into its points. And so by pulling into its own center, that object, which now has a line and a current is forming in the form of dielectric, is pulling toward its own center. So we call that counter space. So you got space out here, opposite that is counter space. It mathematically, it basically forms a negative space that is trying to fill itself, and as a result, that pull, we experience that as gravity or whatever that pulls things together. And so dielectric movement is that movement towards center is essentially centripetal force, the force that we experience as the axis of something, where it pulls things in. But then on the outside, you have centrifugal force, and that is what the magnetic field is, that repels things from entering and gives it its solid experience or whatever. So you got something that's like gravity to hold it together, and then you got something like that magnetism, the outward radiation, that magnetism. So when I talked about that essence coming off of the earth, the solid element, that's radiation. You're radiating out. The movement, the thermodynamic movement outward. All right, so unheard songs strike the dielectric ether, that is talking about the only attribute of Akash, aka ether, which is sound. So sound is not heard until it has a medium that is interactive with the physical space. So this is why air is the primary means that we use in order to communicate, because the sound is what your body is doing and arranging itself, and all that shaping, and the thought that precedes the actual speech that puts that into motion. It's all of that. And then we just attach that to the air and vibrate it so that it translates as such to a listener. There is no sound if there's nobody to listen to it. I mean, that's that tree falling in the forest type of thing. But if you don't have a brain, if you don't have a mechanism that is designed to translate those vibrations into what we perceive as sound or whatever, then there's no outward sound. It's informational, it's vibrational, or whatever, in its primordial state. So you need those other four things in order to give physicality to that pre-existing truth. Forms appear as their reflections. Alchemy mirrors the four market days. So the same way you had the four elements in alchemy and all of that, they already had that as the Ebo market days. So each of the market days is based on a different element, the exact same four. And you have what's called the Dikenga or Yoa diagram in the Congo. So this is something that they already had before anybody started migrating further north into the west in Africa. They had this in Central Africa. And this idea of constant cycle of moving through these four elements over and over. This is the reincarnation cycle. But in order to master said cycle, instead of constantly being pushed forward by it around the outer rim, you have to move to the center to understand where they all meet. So the market, so you had this idea of them doing commerce and doing trade. Each of those elements meets at the center. And so this is where we get into that whole dielectric situation. If you move to the center, if you understand what's anchoring and moving all of them, the thing that's causing the rotation in the first place, which I'll go ahead and tell you is the golden spiral. So the golden ratio as a logarithmic spiral is essentially what is facilitating growth due to its scale invariance. So the very, 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 very center view is essentially a Planck pixel. So this is a concept in black hole hologram theory. And so at the center of all things is essentially a black hole pixel. It's very, very, very small. It is 5 times 10 to the negative 70. So imagine the golden ratio and then slap about 70 zeros in front of it. That's about how small you're talking. But that scales up. So what did I calculate it as? I think it was 0.4. So 0.4 times 0.4. So 0.16 square meters if you have something that size, it is resonant with that pixel or whatever. So that's the largest scale, and then all the way down is that pixel. And so this is an organization principle that is used for scale invariance that allows something to transform but still maintain its general proportions and its identity. So that's what you are as a human. You have that principle active for you. So you go from that extremely small zygote into the 5-pointed body that you are now. Okay, so all that principle is within there. Once you go to the middle, once you compress the universe into a point, then it unfolds not as a circle, but as a square. So not as a spirit, but as a body. So you had to compress all the spiritual information of you, all the quantum information of you into a small point, and then like the center of a cymatic figure or a mandala or whatever else, just like how that geometry of that sound radiates out from that center. That is exactly what you're doing. You just are radiating out very, very, very slowly. You are a very slow sound expanding from that one point, which was an edge. The IY switch. So there's a difference between Cipher, Cipher, which is a circle, is a field, and then Cipher is encoding. So CY Cipher, that's a code. That's the method. So you use encoding in order to project a field. I is the inward eye that decodes. So the cipher, the field, is what is the decoding, the decompression. The Y is the branching Y that tests. So it's the question. It's the riddle. The riddle is what constantly pushes you into seek an answer. That's what the surface is. So the surface is the answer. The questioner is at the center. The observer, that's you. You are the questioner. You're the one who asks why. This is also a double entendre for the Y chromosome in relation to that ALU insertion the YAP ALU insertion I just talked about earlier. Switch wrongly and 7 becomes 11 by slight. Anytime you see 7 and 11 mentioned together, that is usually a encoded reference to the proportions of the pyramid's height to its base with the Great Pyramid. So keep that in mind. If you look at the pyramid from top down, it is a square with an X in the middle that is pointing to a point. So that is essentially a metaphor for your body unfolded from that center point. 34 is not 74. So this is a reference to 3 plus 4 adding to 7, but we do not born 7 plus 4. We do not get 11 by doing 7 and 4 because it is descending. If we did 47, 4 plus 7, you could do that, and then I'll give you 11. But if you have the number 74, we do not born that out. You may be able to deal with it as subtraction, so that if Allah God loses his culture, you end up with a misunderstanding. The inverse of that, if the understanding of the child adds culture, and the culture of freedom is our God, our self, Lord, and Master. So if he has this revelation through the mathematics, he grows to recognize himself as Allah God. Remember, Allah and El are the exact same thing. They come from the exact same Semitic root. They're referring to the same thing. And that is the architecture of you. That is what is manifesting. The information associated with that is what's manifesting as you as the image of God or the understanding. Subtract God by what you see. So that's 7 minus 3. Do the knowledge before the wisdom, not the other way around, or fall from the ledge into the pit that calls itself proof. So it's headed in the direction of ignorance. If you do the wisdom, which is the ways and actions, if you act before you observe, if you're judging by the manifestation and not by the observer that is making said manifestation, then you fall into ignorance. You fall into misunderstandings. That's the science. Serpent and bull, winged and wreathed. Apis in the cube, Apophis in the coil. So the Apis bull, that is Epaphus. So Epaphus is the son of Zeus with Io. He turned into a bull, turned her into a cow, so they could have the child, Epaphus, who is said to be the ancestor of the Ethiopians. Ethiopian was a term that they used in general for sub-Saharan people, more accurately people who live below the equator, in what they refer to as either the land of the gods or the land of the spirits. Everybody in the ancient world referred to it as such because the Greeks learned basically everything they know from the Egyptians. The Egyptians learned through exchange with the Nubians and the Nubians, so on and so forth. So there was a lot of interaction and exchange and all this going on. So everybody got this, ended up with the same underlying machinery for their systems and their myths and everything else. And so long as they respected their underlying machinery, it was easy to convert between one and the other. It was easy to syncretize. So the Apis bull, this thing was already a concept in Egypt, and they just hooked up Epaphus, the Greek concept, with him. Apis in the cube, Apophis in the coil. Apophis, that is translated as the adversary of Ra as a son, but then Ra is the wholeness, the completion, the central concept, the unmanifest. And so this idea of the adversary is more along the lines of the constraint. So by you placing this logarithmic constraint on the infinite and vast information, you're essentially making it manageable enough for us to actually be able to interact with and perceive. And so the golden ratio manifests itself in the physical plane as the Fibonacci sequence. So it's not perfectly the golden ratio, but by placing things in specific proportion to one another, according to the Fibonacci sequence, it basically gives you an image that resonates well with the actual golden spiral. And so that organization principle gives it certain properties that make it far more efficient in the way that it is organized and the way it scales up. Taurus, so some wordplay between those, same phonetical pronunciation, but you're talking about the donut here, you're talking about the bull here, or whatever. The bull is often associated with the moon, the crescent moon to be exact. You know, it appears like horns. And just like I told you earlier, the movement of the moon forms a toroid. So oscillation, giving world its sway, the winged serpent. So this same symbol became a symbol of Hermes, aka Mercury. Thoth, Quetzalcoatl over in Mesoamerica. All of these are considered to be related to the same figure who created writing and was involved with magic and language, all of that good stuff. Hermes, Thoth, Quetzalcoatl. With Hermes in particular, his name comes from heap or heap of stones, something like this. This is the same meaning of Mer, meaning pyramid. It also means water courses. And so once again, we are talking about this pyramid. I just gave you the image of the top-down view of the pyramid. And this idea of spiraling toward that center. So all of that is part of the exact same line of symbolism is Dan's emblem. So that serpent of the judgment. His name is also related to distribution. So to spread, to disperse. This is the means by which the infinite distributes itself as individual forms. Is what all this is describing. Messengers who do not topple idols, but teach stone to remember its own song. So the point was never to just sit around worshiping statues and stuff. It was to build these things with specific materials and specific grooves in them that serve as resonance wave guides so that you could recreate the frequential experience of a particular thing or force. And so you could make a statue of you that has your same resonance and then allows you to tether to this world in return as often as you think. Now that sounds, mystical and whatever else, because I'm being very nonchalant about how I'm describing it now, but once you understand the underlying concepts of it in detail, you're like, okay, that makes perfect sense. That is exactly how I'm occupying a body right now. So I don't see why it wouldn't work like that too. Noetic balance, Abrahamic edge. Mother conscious peoples kept contracts with forces. No conquest, just reciprocity with rivers and stars. Father conscious covenants added rails for fire so it would warm, not consume. Mixing chafe, then reconcile. Child of both, we learn to govern heat with love and let devotion kneel to understanding. When you hear people talk about the mother goddess society and this egalitarian way that things operated, the worship of the feminine and all of this, before it was really just connection with the earth. So by you connecting with the earth and then understanding your connection with that bridge between those two reveals the logarithm, and that is your pathway to understanding the Father. Because if you look at yourself, let's say you live only with your mother. You've only ever known your mother. You have a lot of things in common with your mother. Some of that is learned, but some of it is very innate. It's just stuff you inherited directly from her, epigenetically. Everything about your design, everything about your ways and actions, whatever you didn't get from her that isn't from some other outside influence, you got from your father. So to know your father, you simply have to know yourself. Everything that is not your mother is ultimately likely from your father. That is just a metaphor in order to bridge the concept of the quantum aspect of you. If you look at the geometry of your body, which comes from the mother aspect, the physical body, then you understand what it is that you get from God. The part that is unmanifest, that unmanifest potential. Because of those constraints of that geometry that is following that math or whatever, your brain works in a certain way. Therefore, it shapes a lot of the aspects that essentially you shape into an ego and a personality. All right. So when they would make these temples or effigies or whatever else, they were designed to coordinate with the natural vibrations and frequencies of the earth, which we know as the Schumann resonance. So that's 7.83 hertz. Its second harmonic is 14.3 hertz. Its octave, which means it's double, is 15.66 hertz. And if you play 15.66 hertz through some sand or some water, it will make a star-like shape, and then that's how you get the shape of your body. They built these things, including pyramids. Pyramids are just a huge version of this same concept they were doing in West Africa, where based on the vibration and its interaction with the grid that was made here, it could communicate. So by constraining the vibration, they could tell by where it vibrates what it was communicating. And so you would basically make a contract with the earth. The earth knows what it wants, what it needs. It's an entire system that was built from the ground up. Everything from the bacteria in the soil to the plants to the animals, creatures, they were all made from the same set of processes. All life on the planet has a shared ancestor in the form of some single cell organism long time ago. Whenever you get ready to grow into a human, you are essentially a single cell organism that multiplies into a whole colony that is so well coordinated that it experiences itself as a single entity. That is the difference. The only difference. But you would make these contracts with the land by understanding what it needs, what to do, what not to do, and you would do that before you were settled in a place. When colonization came along, they did not give a damn about these contracts and covenants with the earth, and they just come through and they rape her and they destroy it and mess up the environment, and it is essentially over time their own undoing. Father consciousness covenants added rails for fire, so we're talking about like the altar builders and all the stuff that you basically get in the Bible. Because very much so after 4004 BC, you have these people who are obsessed with the sky and their interpretation of what is being said there. They respect that aspect, the unmanifest potential, but they did not respect the physical. They didn't understand the point of it, the purpose of it. They didn't respect the woman. They didn't respect the mothers as much as they should have. But in our original way of doing things, we understood this, and respect was given where respect was due. Mixing chafe, then reconcile the father aspect, the study of the sky, the heavens, the Akashic record, the grid, the matrix, the patrix, thing that punches the holes in the first place. If you understand the relationship between these two things, the mother and the father, the relationship between the quantum and the matrix, you become a child who understands themselves and thus becomes good at working the logarithm, not the algorithm, but the logarithm, so that you don't spiral out of control, but you spiral inward so that you can emerge and grow outward and expand beyond what it is that you are. Because you are the child of both aspects, the quantum and the arithmos. Math is how you work the numbers. We learn to govern heat with love and let devotion kneel to understanding. So that was, that thermodynamics we were talking about, and the serpent membrane. I associate that with infrared radiation, because your skin, the melanin of your skin, is what converts UV light into infrared heat, as well as phonons. So paths for that heat to disperse. So those phonons are essentially sound in the lattice of your body, in that membrane. So it's basically doing something very similar to what you would expect with a microchip. Your skin, if it's like this, it is a natural semiconductor and a transducer for radiation. The forge of language, as tongues evolve, so does the world. Letters process. Yod to I to J. There was no such thing as J once upon a time. You had Yod, Yod, Eod, and then you had the I come out of it, J. So this is why you don't even realize that you're essentially saying the same thing with Yahweh and Yahweh. Because you don't pronounce G's in Igbo. I know it's spelled I-G-B-O, but it's pronounced Igbo. So likewise, it's Iwe. So the same thing as Yahweh. What you came to know is Yahweh. That is Yad He. Yeah. And then I don't even know why it's pronounced with a whoop sound. when it's Hebrew, because it's an O sound for Vav. As it's evolved, Wa is an Arabic letter, so it's Ye, O He, Ye, O He, Yahweh, Yahweh. Amma Dioha. So that's combining some stuff. Amma is the probability cloud, the ayin, if you will, the amma in Arabic. Dio, Deus, that which is invoked, so called in, sound coming inward. That which is purified. Remember, that is to return to the pure state, the Akashic state. Spirit, spirit attached to a mouth, spirit connected to a mouth. Then they say you were breath that God breathed into some dust, some earth. You are an Nkisi. The same thing that y'all call idols or whatever else. The problem is not the statue itself. The problem is, what is it attached to? What is it connected to? What is it pointing to? If you totally bypass and overlook what it's pointing to, it's just the same thing as the Bruce Lee quote. It was like, if I point my finger at the moon, don't stare at my finger or you'll miss all that heavenly glory. That is, everything is something that points back at this one thing. And yet the current stays, the Dio and the thunder. So that's a reference to Deus, Zeus, so Zeus. Remember that thing I said about the square root of 2 earlier? Well, the first 4 digits of the square root of 2, 1414, translate alphanumerically to Adad, which is the name of the Sumerian or later Babylonian storm god. So he's the equivalent of Amadioha, the equivalent of Zeus, the equivalent of Shango. It's all the same concept. The lightning, the Schumann resonance, with the connection between the sky god and the earth goddess, is the Schumann resonance. Schumann resonance, that's 7.83. That is the same frequency that your alpha theta range of brain waves operates in when you're having an out-of-body experience. That second harmonic at 14.3 hertz is the is alpha beta range of your brain waves associated with attention and the way that your thalamus filters reality, what I was talking about before. So you've got the one that allows you to loosen that gate and experience the universe, and then you got that other one that filters it out to give you waking experience. So you're in that state when you're awake and relaxed. Fourier proves the fragment holds the hymn. So Fourier is a Fourier transform. It's a signal that can be reconstructed. If you have a partial part of it, you can reconstruct the whole signal. So that's the same holographic principle here. Holograph of the whole inside a shard of sound. Om is the primordial sound that all other sounds can be shaped from. As I explained the other day, it is essentially just the sound ah as you're closing your mouth. As you close your mouth while saying ah, you hear it sounds like om, but all I did was say ah, and while I was closing my mouth so that it bends the sound and then forces it to interact with the teeth and lips and the Word is bond because the world is bound. Your word is bond. Strength, your membrane, the binding, the constraint. To speak is to tension the string. Break your bond and spokes shear from the wheel. Keep it and the city rolls true over time. Integrity is not morality, it's engineering. We're talking about structural integrity. If you understand it based on structure rather than some morality that was taught to you, you know what's right or wrong. You can feel it. But the best test of it is whether it continues to be able to stand on its own. The truth can stand on its own 2 legs. a wheel that's missing spokes. It can roll, it continue to roll for a while, but eventually it is going to wear down, break down. And that is how most of us are living our lives. We give our words to things. We make promises to ourselves with regards to our dreams and our aspirations, and we do not fulfill on those because we convince ourselves that it's okay. But when you realize that each time that you give your word to something, you are shaping a new reality and initiating a process of manifestation that needs to be watered and cultivated the same way that a seed needs cultivation before it can become a tree. So if you plant the seed and then you don't commit to watering it or whatever else, it's going to die off and you're going to act like it was never there to begin with. But your word, there is a consequence for you setting that word in motion and not fulfilling on it or whatever. That is not about guilt, but it is about being able to honor your word. If for some reason you can't honor your word, now if you can't keep your word, that's one thing, but to honor it is to adjust your plan. So you revisit it and you look at, okay, well, I was going to try to be there at 5 o'clock, but then a meteor fell on the highway. I can't control that, but I give you my word, I will be there by 8 o'clock. I understand the impact of me not being there, but I'll be there at 8 o'clock. The eagle's ascent, the higher the flight, the kinder the landing. Dan serpent did not vanish, it learned to glide. Wisdom kept, vantage gained. Saints return not to conquer Rome, but to refresh the page and leave the change log visible. So when the saints come marching in, all right, we talked about that stuff. Distribution, knowledge, coheres at power. So knowledge is power, therefore equality is power. That is stated in the Supreme Alphabet definition for power, which is strength, energy, magnetism. Truth is the ultimate power, star or child. Knowing that knowledge is power, therefore equality is power. Power in the sense of the Supreme Alphabet is, well, not, so the fifth letter is equality in the Supreme Alphabet, whereas the fifth number is power. So you have this interplay right there. The number 6 is equality, but the letter E is equality. And so if you kind of understand the dynamics of that word play right there, thing they have in common is knowledge, which is to know, look, listen, observe, and also respect, a body of accumulated facts. The key to all aspects, the foundation for everything in existence. Knowledge is symbolic of the Asiatic black man. So his equality is that 5-point structure of his, to be equal with all nations, people of the earth. The thing you have in common with every single person on the planet is that arm, leg, arm, head. That is the acronym for Allah. The ring pays out in common light. No private sons, just shared daylight. You all sons. Whether you're righteous or not, that's for you to determine. What returns ascends. What ascends returns. That's toroidal movement, so it's coming back around each time. The circle exhales, the page refreshes, not to erase, but to reveal the history of edits. Breath returns, bearing the ledger of what changed and what endured. So you see how the ending of that is similar to the beginning. The circle inhales, the page refreshes, not to erase, but to reveal the history of edits. Breath returns, bearing the ledger of what changed. The circle exhales, the page refreshes, not to erase, but to reveal the history of edits. Breath returns, bearing the ledger of what changed and what endured. So it's a recursive loop. The canto itself, Canto 15, is itself a cipher, looping back in on itself. And on that note, I'll catch you on the next one when we move to, speaking of which, power in Canto 16. Well, I feel like I should be further ahead. So are we supposed to be on episode 7? What episode are we on? Hold on, we're supposed to, let's see. Because we're always 2 episodes ahead because we had introduction and prologue. So 10. So I should have had 13 for Masta. I should have had 14 for, 15 for this. So I don't know how we on episode 16. It should be episode 17. I had to check the number once I get over YouTube, but I'm going to let you go. I'll fix that on my own time. See you next time. Peace.